Classical mythologies have shaped the very world we live in.
Yeah, whatever. I don't have time for dense, dusty old books, Paul.
Great. Well, that's what podcasts are for.
Oh, good point.
Join me, Paul, as I teach my best friend and improv comedy partner, Sarah, all about mythology on Myth Understood.
Mythology is frequently explicit, obscene, violent, and bizarre, though, right?
Yeah.
So there's a lot to joke about and improvise along the way?
Yes.
Oh.
So come for the mythology and stay for the absurdity on Myth Understood.
Available now at mythunderstoodpodcast.com and your podcast platform of choice.
It's Myth Understood.
It's the greatest mystery in literary history. A divisive question with highly contested answers. Who was the writer behind the pen name William Shakespeare? Welcome to Don't Quill the Messenger. Here's your host, Stephen Sable.
Welcome back, fellow Quillers. So glad you could join us for yet another episode of Don't Quill the Messenger. Today's guest is one of my favorites. It's so exciting for me to have her back here on the program. She is one of the rock stars of the Oxfordian movement, in my opinion, and in your opinion as well, because she currently holds the record for the most popular podcast episode of 2020 on Don't Quill the Messenger. She is Katherine Chiljan, and she has studied the Shakespeare authorship question for more than 30 years. Her interest was piqued after watching a debate between the great Charlton Ogburn, author of Mysterious William Shakespeare, 1984. If you don't have that in your collection, go get it. But there was a debate between him and a Shakespeare professor that convinced Katherine that the 17th Earl of Oxford was indeed the real Shakespeare. So she started doing her own research and eventually published 2 anthologies about the illustrious Earl, as well as acted as the editor of the Shakespeare Oxford newsletter for several years. In 2003, she debated English professors on this topic at the Smithsonian Institution. How about that? Soon after, she was inspired to write her book, Shakespeare Suppressed, The Uncensored Truth About Shakespeare and His Works, which was published in 2011 and reprinted again in 2016. If you don't have that book, you know I have said many times it definitely belongs in your collection. The book took almost 7 years to complete, earned her an award for distinguished scholarship from Concordia University in Portland. And she has since become one of the contributors to Contested Year, which was also published in 2016, which uncovered errors in a recent book about King Lear by a prominent Shakespeare professor whom we won't even mention here on this program, even though most of you know who he is. She currently serves on the board of the Shakespeare Authorship Coalition, and it is my pleasure to invite her back to this Quillers episode. Welcome, Katherine. So good to have you.
So good to be on your awesome show, Stephen. Thank you.
Now, the last time you were here, we talked about your book, Shakespeare Suppressed. And as I mentioned, it has been the most popular episode of this series for the entire year of 2020. There are episodes from the original first season that have a higher download ratio, but a lot of that is because they've been there over time. And as we develop and acquire new listeners, they, of course, go back and start at the beginning. But you hold the title, and I think that's something to be extremely proud about.
Wow, I sure am. That is so nice.
But today we're going to talk about a little bit different slant to the topic, and something that a lot of our listeners, and especially newcomers to the Shakespeare authorship question, ask me about, send emails about, in discussions that I have with people in my immediate circles. One of the questions people ask all the time is, how did the guy from Stratford end up with the title? Why is he the guy? Why are we having to work so hard to overcome him as the guy? How did all of that happen? And so today that's going to be the topic of our discussion.
Yes. Be happy to do that.
Some of the questions that I always hear and that I have myself boil down to this. Was it on purpose? If so, when did it begin to be on purpose? Was it an accident? And if so, how did that accident happen? Or was it a combination of both, this sort of accidental thing that later others seized upon because it was what I like to call a crime of opportunity? What has your research found?
Well, it was definitely not an accident. It was very deliberate, and it was pretty much the brainchild, I think, of Ben Jonson with his patron, the Earl of Pembroke, with the first folio. They contrived it to be the Stratford Man. And I just want to start out by saying the Stratford Man had nothing to do with this whatsoever. He was a moneylender who branched out to London, and I think he started giving loans out there. His first notice in London was in 1592 when he gave a loan to John Clayton, and later he tried to recoup that loan. And then the next notice we have about him was in 1595, where he's receiving a payment along with two actors for a performance before Queen Elizabeth, not them being the performers, but just a performance in front of the Queen by the Lord Chamberlain's men. So this indicates that he was definitely involved in the finances part of theater. That same year or the year after, he was associated with Francis Langley, who was the creator, builder of the Swan Theater, which was a very big theater. And they were both named on a restraining order with two women, threatening someone's life, I think, something along that. But
so wait a minute, they had TROs, temporary restraining orders, issued against them.
Yes, yeah, like William Waite. He was in fear of his life apparently from these four people. Who knows what the real circumstances are? But the point of that document was that he was involved with someone who owned a theater. So pretty early in the 1590s, there he is. And I think that word got out that, how interesting. Here's somebody he's involved in the theater, but his name is also William Shakespeare, like the great poet of Venus and Adonis and Rape of Lucrece, the two huge poems that were published in 1593 and 1594. And I think Ben Jonson must have met him because he satirized the Stratford Man in Every Man in His Humor and Every Man Out of His Humor, which were written in the 1597, 99, something like that, those two plays. And he kind of made fun of him wanting so much to be a gentleman in both of those plays. And in Every Man Out, it was, his coat of arms, in essence, paying somebody for his coat of arms, which may really have happened. We know that there was some, funny business about the granting of the arms.
So whatever we can say about the Stratford Man, one of the things that you're pointing to here is actual documentary evidence that he existed and some of his activities, which are not literary at all, but are mostly financial. And we do know that he was a grain dealer. He was a money lender. He liked to sue people over small amounts of money. We have documents that prove that in his life. And when we put together the real documents, it doesn't paint any kind of picture of a writer or anyone with any real theatrical ability at all. It really paints him more as just sort of a producer, backer / financier of some sort. Is that pretty much clearly how it goes?
Exactly. He was on the business end. He also bought theater shares at the Globe and the Blackfriars Theater. And, the one thing that kind of is the Stratfordian's ace in the hole is that he was a member of the King's Men in 1603. And, he's prominently named, the first one named, but we have no evidence that he acted at all. But his name being on that list could have been because he was a financial backer of it too. So, yes, I think he was he was not at all involved in writing or acting, as far as
Do
the
you
evidence
think
goes.
that all of the actors of that time were literate, or do you think that perhaps maybe there were illiterate actors who learned their lines by memorization or wrote recitation to them and then sort of parroting those lines?
No, I think they were literate. I think they could read, for sure. They could read scripts. I mean, I'm not a theater expert historian in that sense. But I think they were literate. But I think the Stratford man was illiterate, or maybe he could barely write his name. But that's about it, right?
Well,
that's
I
why.
have to
That's
agree with
why
you.
he
I
was
think
such
all
a.
evidence points to him being completely illiterate.
I'm sorry. What was that?
I said I have to agree with you. I think that the evidence points to him being illiterate.
Yes.
That his parents were illiterate and that his children were illiterate.
Right. I think that argues, and therefore he probably could not be an actor if he couldn't read scripts. So, yeah, it's not in his favor. But again, like I said, this has nothing to do with him being Shakespeare. He didn't claim to be Shakespeare. His family didn't claim it. He was just really involved in the business side of the theater. I really want to grant him that. And I don't want to blame him for, acing out Oxford. And he was not his front man either. This happened after both of their deaths, in my opinion, and it was contrived, as I mentioned.
Can you sort of paint a picture for us of like what you would propose as the timeline of events that started to form this charade and make this happen?
Yes. Well, I don't know. Do you want to talk about Oxford or just, what was going on with Oxford, or shall we talk about the evidence that there was a plan afoot?
Well, I think that you have to sort of combine it all together, right?
Right.
And I think that's one of the things that can become complicated for our listeners, especially people who are new to the Shakespeare authorship question. And I point this out regularly in just about every episode that, sometimes we can get into the weeds sometimes, those of us who know all these players and all these names. And one thing I point out all the time is that, something that's confusing to newcomers is, wait a minute, you just called him Oxford. You just called him De Vere. You just called him Burleigh. You just called him Cecil. Wait, I'm so confused. Is he Burleigh? Is he Cecil? Yes. Is he Oxford? Is he De Vere? Yes. It's like a bad. It's Elizabethan who's on first sometimes.
Right. It is a little complicated.
So it can be a little complicated for people to put all of that together. So I like to sort of walk people through it where I feel like they might need a little bit of extra assistance or guidance. So let's try to be sure to do that as we go along.
Yes. Well, I mean, number one, Edward de Vere, 17th Earl of Oxford, was the true author of Shakespeare, and that William Shakespeare was his pen name. I think he had used it for a few decades, before the Stratford man even came along in the 1590s. And he kind of got involved. Well, I mean, where my starting point for all this is 1601, Love's Martyr. That was a book written by Robert Chester, 1601, and it's an allegory about the phoenix. That Mother Nature wants the phoenix to find a mate and have a child for the succession, something like that. And it was truly meant as an allegory for Queen Elizabeth, and anyone who looks at it can read it in that way. And ultimately, the book reveals that the phoenix had a child. A princely phoenix, and Chester was urging her to accept this princely phoenix as her heir, And now in 1601, the queen was up in years, and she would die actually in 2 more years at that point. And she hadn't named a successor. So in essence, there is like a hidden prince, and Robert Chester wants the queen to acknowledge this hidden prince and make her his heir, her heir.
What do we know about Robert Chester?
Very little. After the book was written, we really never hear about him again. So he was associated with someone named Salisbury. I'm sorry, I don't have that information in front of me. But the point about this book is that William Shakespeare contributed 2 verses to it, along with George Chapman, Ben Jonson, John Marston. And they were writing on similar theme about accepting this princely phoenix, for the queen accepting him. And Shakespeare's phrases were along those lines, but not direct. But the point was his involvement in this work, which really touched on the succession, was a bit dangerous. So the queen finally dies in 1603, and this princely phoenix did not succeed her. It was King James I of Scotland.
Would you say that Johnson's involvement in that publication, Love's Martyr, would then constitute his knowledge that there was a secret prince and that he was a part of a movement to encourage the queen to accept that secret prince?
Well, I don't know how directly with the queen, but he certainly was aligning himself with Oxford Shakespeare by being involved in that book. So all of them, curiously, in 1605, all of them, of course, Oxford was dead at that point, they were arrested for their play Eastward Ho. And I think that it had something to do with Love's Martyr, but that's kind of outside of the point. But when Oxford died in 1604, there was complete silence. No one said anything. And I think it had to do with Love's Martyr, because that was somewhat of a treasonous work. He didn't want James to be the king. He wanted this hidden prince to be the king, theoretically. So I think most people in the literary world and just regular people just refused to even mention his name, not even to say the man died. And yet he was so important in the literary world. He was a patron of the arts. He was somebody of such high status, and no one said a word. And I think that had to do with Love's Martyr and this issue of the fair youth in the sonnets, which were in circulation. And the sonnets, the fair youth in the sonnets is the young man that the great author lauds over and over. And he described him in princely terms, like he was of even higher status than himself.
Yeah, I think that's very clearly evident in the sonnets, as well as I think in the 2 poems that are dedicated to the Earl of Southampton. We see some connection there as well. One of the things that I think is interesting about the silence, that deafening silence at Oxford's death, when you look at the number of artists whom he helped in their lifetimes, whether it was writers, composers, musicians, actors for the acting troupes that he was patron of. Like, he supported so many artists.
Yes.
And when you look today, somebody who has offered that many artists some sort of opportunity to create their art or foster their careers or develop or publish their works or perform on the stage. If somebody today was a patron of the arts like that, passes away today, there are so many tributes. There are poems and songs and tributary videos that are created to honor that person. And it is really shocking that this man, who was the patron of more than 25 publications and musicians and actors and writers, it doesn't receive any of that.
No. And I think that the silence was due to fear, a fear of being accused of treason. I think that was in the air, honestly. And on top of that, he was, just before Oxford's death and right after his death, he was slandered in 2 plays by Thomas Dekker, Satyromastics and Westward Ho, and which I write about that in the Oxfordian, volume 21 of the Oxfordian. And, something was going on where they beyond this silence, they were execrating him at his death. I mean, it was terrible. And this was a man who, in 1624, Gervase Markham said that everyone knew how he was charitable, how he fed the poor, and that he was even religious at the end. And so all of this was just really it really was tragic when you think about it. Outside of that, you have in late 1604, early 1605, Christmas activities, celebrations at court, the royal court. You have several Shakespeare plays being performed there, right?
Is that the same winter that the Earl of Oxford's daughter is getting married to one of the patrons of the First Folio?
The Earl of Montgomery, yes.
Montgomery, right?
I think
Not
it
Pembroke,
was.
but Montgomery.
Yes, I think it was the Christmas time after Oxford's death. So, late December, early January area. And
so he dies not long before he's not able to watch his daughter get married. He dies before he's able to see his daughter get married.
Right.
And in his absence, they hold this great Christmas time, 12th night, 12 days of Christmas time celebration. And it is mostly filled with plays attributed to the pseudonym William Shakespeare.
Yes. And also, very importantly, at this exact time, late December, early 1605, you have Hamlet being published in its 2nd edition, and a much bigger version of Hamlet. Not the first quarto of Hamlet in 1603 was probably a pirated copy. It was very incomplete. This one was full, more complete, and on the first page of text of the play, there were royal arms on it. So this in combination to me says it was okay to print the plays as long as only the pen name is on it, pen name only. So it seemed like the policy was to perpetuate the pen name. And, nothing to do with the Stratford man at this point. And we're talking about 1605 time period. But then that was to change. And I think the next crisis was 1609, the publication of Shakespeare's sonnets, which, are all about the fair youth and, the idea of him being a prince, perhaps, and Queen Elizabeth's child. So that, I think, is what triggered the need to obliterate Oxford's connection forever, not with just a pen name, but with putting somebody else in his place. And
now I want to ask you, and forgive me for putting you on the spot, but I do want to ask you, because you're such a prominent figure in the Oxfordian movement. Your book is so well known, and you're such a popular guest on this podcast series. Do you ever feel like you have to dance around the PT theory, that you have to be soft-shelled about it? when you talk about things like the sonnets and the idea that the fair youth is Queen Elizabeth's child. Do you feel like you have to kind of like walk soft-footed on eggshells about that? Or do you feel like you could just say straightforward, here's what my book says and here's what I believe, and that's how it is for me?
Yeah, you're right. I do feel that I have to be a little bit careful because there are other theories, and I'm not discounting those other theories. But I think that this one, the main reason is political, that it involved the succession. I think that's the most plausible one in light of the evidence. And so what I do in the last 2 chapters of my book is I look at the evidence and I try and connect the dots with my interpretation. And yeah, I mean, I think that really anyone who puts forward a theory has to be a little bit on the humble side because we weren't there. We don't know. And in absence of any other evidence, I mean, that's really all we can do is, make conjectures. And I'm hoping that with time, a new letter will come to light that will shed more light in this direction. But for me, the theory really works very easily in this way. I think you're more favored too in that regard.
Yes, and I feel like one of the things that makes it difficult for people in today's modern era is I don't think that we truly comprehend the importance, the all-encompassing importance the succession had over every single thing that was happening in those first few years of the 1600s. I don't think we can really wrap our heads around that today. We recently in modern times right now, Prince Philip just passed away. By the way, an authorship skeptic, a professed authorship skeptic. I don't know that he ever came out in the camp of the Earl of Oxford, but he definitely did not believe the Stratford man was the writer. He made that very clear throughout his lifetime. And so, here the grandfather of the heirs apparent has passed on. The Queen is aging. She has not named a successor. And so even today, it's still an issue and it's still a topic of speculation and scandal and chat. And you've got Harry off here and William off there. But Charles had an affair with a married woman. So can he be king? There may not be another monarch of England when Elizabeth II dies. I don't know. It could be a paradigm shift about to happen. But the point being is, I don't think we can really comprehend how crucial it was in 1603 when the Queen was on her deathbed that somebody be named that the people could accept that wouldn't thrust the country into all-out civil war.
Yes. And, well, that was, Shakespeare dealt with that topic of the succession in a few of the history plays too. So it was very important. And we're talking about a totalitarian state, really. And if you were suspected of treason, you could die. So you had to be very careful. And anyone who commented about Shakespeare was very careful. There's a lot of cryptic comments about him. And in 1607, for example, a man named Barkstead, he was an actor and author, and he openly said, Shakespeare, laurel is due to him. In other words, he needs to be credited. And he also made an inference that he was already dead in 1607, which of course works with Oxford. But most people who commented about Shakespeare did it so in a cryptic manner. And that lends itself to the idea that there's something hot about Oxford, about Shakespeare. And unfortunately, we have to analyze these sort of cryptic pieces of evidence so people can understand them today and show it that it is indeed evidence. what people thought about Shakespeare, that many thought it was a pen name. Many thought he wrote anonymously. Many thought he was someone of high rank. Some thought that he wrote as a hobby. These are all things I cover in chapter 15, what contemporaries thought about Shakespeare. But these points never seem to make it in the traditional Shakespeare biographies. And, that was my point of
and ironically,
out.
Throughout English history, we see time and time again so much evidence of how dangerous it was to even theorize that someone else had a more legitimate claim to the throne than whoever was being thrust forward as the heir to the throne at the time. It didn't matter if it was Richard of Gloucester, and then suddenly, his two nephews disappear mysteriously in the Tower of London, which is a great example. Whether it's Henry Bolingbroke arriving to depose Richard II
Yes.
and claiming the throne for himself. Obviously, being on the winning side was super important.
Yes.
But it was so dangerous to be on the losing side or the minority side, even if you truly believed your candidate had a more legitimate claim.
Yes. And further to that point, how is it that someone, supposedly a commoner, was writing about the succession, about, Richard II getting deposed, showing that on the stage, Henry VI, the Duke of Suffolk, sitting on his throne, wanting to take it away from him. How was this commoner able to portray these events, which could incite perhaps riots or give people ideas about, maybe we can take the throne too, with no recrimination?
I think that's pretty impossible, quite frankly. I think, Bonner Miller Cutting has a great presentation that she gives about the tortures and the sufferings that writers went through during the Elizabethan era for some of the things that they put pen to paper. And you're right. I think that's one of the great factors in all of this that no Stratfordian can really argue against. Explain to me why your guy didn't lose a hand or his head for some of the things he wrote when contemporaries around him were losing hands and heads for things that they wrote.
Oh, yeah, definitely. And what about the Essex Rebellion, showing Richard II just before the rebellion started? Why wasn't Shakespeare questioned by the authorities? So 1601 was really a heavy year and for the great author, and nothing happened to him as far as we know. So.
You mentioned the deafening silence when Oxford dies, and I've actually talked to some people who believe that maybe he didn't die, and some people who believe that yes, he did die, but it may have been by suicide. And so that was part of the reason for the hush-hush and quietness and why we don't know where his grave is, because he couldn't be buried in consecrated ground if he took his own life. But let's talk about the deafening silence when William Stratford dies.
Exactly. Nothing was said. Nothing was said until the First Folio, which was 7 years later. So that, to me, that really tells you there's something wrong going on. When you have, for example, Edmund Spenser, when he died in 1599, many people noted it. We have letters saying, oh, well, he died. Our great poet has died. They had a funeral, and William Camden wrote about the funeral, and that writers threw their pens in his grave. And he was buried in Westminster Abbey, too. So, I mean, it's impossible that somebody as popular as William Shakespeare was in his day, that if he were the Stratford man, for sure they would have mentioned something in 1616 about his death. And, of course, they didn't. And
I love that image, though, of writers tossing their quills into the grave before the dirt is shoveled on. That's a great image. And you would think that, yes, there would have been such an image at the death of this great writer, unless A, he was such a hot topic and you might have been accused of treason for supporting him, or B, in the case of the Stratford man, he wasn't really a writer at all and nobody really cared.
Right. I think that you're right on both points. Yeah. As far as it being suicide, I think that's a very interesting theory, and I wouldn't discount it. Because,
he certainly was plagued by deep, deep melancholy throughout his life. Whether you see him as the writer Shakespeare or not, Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford, definitely suffered from tremendous bouts of melancholia through his life, and also tremendous bouts of manic behavior through his life. And I'm beginning to formulate an idea in my mind that he definitely had some issues with that, that he was a manic depressive, perhaps.
Yeah, well, many artists are,
That's very true. We have even those of us who are, for the most part, and I'm going to claim that I'm for the most part emotionally stable, but even those artists of us who are for the most part emotionally stable, we still have our highs and lows, and our highs and lows are far more extreme than non-artists, I think, because of our artistic nature, it's just who we are. We're extremely passionate about everything, whether it's excitement or sadness or whatever it is in between. We tend to be a little overly impassioned. I get that. It's something that my wife tells me I have to check every once in a while.
Yes, well, he was definitely like that, and he felt things very, very, very deeply, and he was sensitive to so many things. All you have to do is just read one play, and you can see how beyond he goes in his analysis of things. Taking it to different heights. That's one of his great, part of his greatness.
When do you believe the first folio project first was engendered, as it were?
Yes. I want to go back really quickly to the publishing of the sonnets, and
Okay.
that was a great crisis. And I think that shortly afterwards, Thomas Thorpe, who was the publisher, I think he tried to backtrack on the sonnets by decontextualizing them. In 1612, he published a funeral elegy by W.S., initials only, W.S. Now, of course, later, recently, in recent times, it's believed to be actually written by John Ford. A very good case was made, I think, by Richard Kennedy. What they did was they tried to make it appear that this William Peter, the one that they're writing the elegy about, he was murdered actually in January of 1612. They tried to make it appear that he was the fair youth, and that this elegy was a tribute to him, kind of in the same way that Shakespeare made an elegy, made a tribute to the fair youth in the sonnets. And so here you have W.S.'s quote unquote fair youth who died. So it shows that the fair youth was dead, and it shows that W.S., who they kind of present as William Shakespeare, that he was dead, still alive, in 1612, and not dead in 1604 like Oxford. So it seems to be like a little bit of a trick being done here to give this impression.
Do you think Thorpe caught some flack? Do you think he maybe received, some warnings, even maybe some threats that, hey, what did you do here by publishing these sonnets? Or maybe it was an all-in attempt. I'm going to publish these sonnets in a hope that it's going to change the landscape, that it's going to open up some doors, and then that failed. And so it was time to backpedal in order to save his own skin.
Yes. Oh, well, I think it's possible that the Earl of Southampton, who was associated with Thorpe shortly before the sonnets and after the sonnets were published, he patronized a few works. I think that Southampton may have given him the sonnets manuscript to publish, because in 1609, the nobility were not so crazy about James at that point. They were getting to know him, and I think they weren't liking some of his ways. And maybe he thought this was an opportunity. I think it's possible. I can't say factually, of course. But I think that Thorpe got in trouble with the authorities. And I would say the authorities would include the Earl of Pembroke, who very much supported King James and his brother, too, the Earl of Montgomery. So I think that he was trying to cover up what he did with the sonnets publication. And so I think that's kind of the first indication of a cover-up. And then I think they really, wanted to do the whole thing, totally put another individual behind the works, and that would be the Stratford man. And of course, Ben Jonson knew the Stratford man. He satirized him in a couple plays, and I think that he thought he's the perfect person here. He's involved in the theater. He was born with the name William Shakespeare. He's a quote unquote commoner, a man of humble origin, had no court connections whatsoever, and everything would get decontextualized. The sonnets and the plays, which had satirizations of Lord Burleigh, William Cecil, and Sir Robert Cecil too. Depictions of his sister, Anne Cecil, who was Oxford's wife, So everything would be gone. The connection would be gone with Oxford, and he was really the perfect person. And there's hints of this. Francis Beaumont, who was another poet, playwright, he wrote verses to Jonson, hinting at this project, where he says, "Our heirs shall hear how far sometimes a mortal man may go by the dim light of nature." And of course, there's more to it, but I think in essence what he was saying was someone with no education is going to be promoted as a great genius. And we're going to show you, the infiniteness of genius. And that's going to be the coming association of the Stratford man as the great Shakespeare. And
he was right. He was absolutely right.
Yes.
These two guys pulled on the greatest con of all time. Then if you're saying Beaumont and Jonson were in cahoots together, they pulled off the greatest con of all time, knowing that people would just eat it up, hook, line, and sinker, didn't they?
Yes. And this was written while the Stratford man was alive. So I think these ideas were out there and they were planning. And then, of course, the Stratford man died in April of 1616. And at the same time, Jonson, that summer, he completed the first his folio of collected works, Jonson's works, which was patronized in part by the Earl of Pembroke. But Pembroke was Jonson's, long time mentor and supporter. So, and Jonson had in 1616 had just been appointed the Lord Chamberlain. So that meant that he had control over theatrical publication, which
Pembroke was the Lord Chamberlain?
I'm sorry?
You're saying that the Earl of Pembroke became the Lord Chamberlain in 1616.
Yes, December of 1615. So, for 1616 on, he was the Lord Chamberlain. So he had control over what got approved for theatrical publication through the office of the rebels.
Thorpe publishes the sonnets, and we don't know, perhaps either at the Earl of Southampton's urgings, or it could have been Thorpe who urged the Earl of Southampton to share the sonnets with him for publication because he thought he might make some money off of it. Certainly, when we look at the life of the Earl of Southampton, he was led astray many times throughout his life by influences that he should not have listened to.
Yes.
Earl of Essex, for instance, is a great example. But definitely hot-headed and impetuous young male who made several crucial mistakes in his lifetime that ultimately ended in his early demise in my mind. But it doesn't work. It backfires. And so Thorpe is the first person to go, okay, need to backpedal, need to throw up a smoke screen here, need to decontextualize these sonnets, not unlike the way that members of the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust have tried to do in this last year. If you're familiar with some of their new publications, they've decided that the sonnets is a place where they want to attack now because they know that they can't answer the questions that exist there. And then you get Beaumont writing to Johnson saying, this is the course we're going on, and sort of lamenting it, but also being complacent in the plan. And then Johnson gets his own works published first, and maybe then signs on to become the orchestrator of the first folio.
Yeah, I think that's a great summary. Yes, I think that he helped compile the plays and edit the plays, and he brought in people, I think, that he knew, like Hugh Holland, who contributed a poem to the folio preface. None of the people who contributed poems to the folio's preface were really involved in the theater, or, there's so many other people that could have written. Instead, it was these people who were highly educated men. So I think that it was probably their payback for helping edit all these plays. We're talking about 36 plays, and 20 of which had never been in print before. So it was an enormous task, and they needed a lot of help. And I think that's why it took so long. 1623 is when it finally was published.
And so, and you believe that the project for the first folio began as early as 1616?
I think it could have, yes.
Well, that's a 7-year ordeal then, yeah.
Yeah. Or,
that's something you would know something about, isn't it? 7 years to write a book?
Yeah, that's right. That's a great point.
Isn't that something we just mentioned in the introduction to this episode?
Right. That's right. Yeah.
Well, you share something in common with Ben Jonson.
Uh-oh. Okay.
That's an ironic connection there. But what it demonstrates is that, something that is going to have that kind of impact, that is going to hold true for posterity, requires that kind of effort and meticulous poring over and making sure, especially back then when now it has to be typeset letter by letter and dot by dot.
Yes, it was quite an undertaking. And they're big pages, like over 900 large pages full of print. But
I have a Norton facsimile in my possession that I actually purchased at a used bookstore in Ashland, Oregon, many years ago when the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship had their last conference there. And I believe it cost me $125 at the time. And it is to this day still one of my most prized possessions. But it definitely demonstrates the volume that such a work is and was, and what it would have required to print multiple copies of such a work back then in 1623 is almost mesmerizing.
Yes, it really was a very big expense to print this. And, not only just the printing costs, but the typesetters, the people who edited the works, they vastly underestimate how much it costs, because they keep thinking that it was Hemmings and Condell, the actors, who it was their idea and their project, which is nonsense. That they were just used as, in a way, fronts to give us the impression that the Stratford man was their fellow. That's, in their letters where they say that Shakespeare was their friend and fellow. Well, the Stratford man was their friend and fellow. We know that much. He was he named those two actors in his will, the Stratford man. So definitely that was true.
It's really easy to attribute all of this to a guy who can't read so that he doesn't know that he's being used as the Patsy scapegoat. And nothing in the Stratford man's life indicates that he had a single clue that he was being used this way or going to be used this way whatsoever.
No, I don't think he knew. Like I said, I start from the very beginning. He had nothing to do with this. And Oxford had nothing to do with it either. This was contrived after both of their deaths. And I think that the Earl of Pembroke was behind it. And of course, the book was dedicated to him. So
I think that does make the most sense to my mind. The question I would have then is, why publish the first folio at all then? If you're trying to decontextualize the sonnets because it was a mistake that they got printed or a failed effort to spark some sort of revolution or movement against James, who, was not definitely not a popular king by that point. Why even bother with this giant project? Why put it out there?
That's a really good question. I think that, even though I'm not happy that they replaced Oxford with the Stratford man, it was a tremendous tribute to him. I think that they also recognized his greatness. And I think they did want to preserve the plays. So, I give him credit, Pembroke and Montgomery, for that, for sure. Without them, we wouldn't have 20 Shakespeare plays. So I think it was both things. They wanted to keep James in power for as long and his family as long as possible because they were benefiting greatly from him, and they just wanted everything to go nice and smooth. And James's son Charles, he loved Shakespeare. He kept a folio, I think, next to his bedside, if I'm not mistaken. So I think that Shakespeare was appreciated, his works, and I think they were doing their part in that sense. But also they were playing this game to keep politics on their side.
Do you think it was a money-making endeavor? Do you think they profited from the folio?
Well, it did sell out fairly quickly, and then, there were 3 more editions. So, but it seems to me that it was Edmund Blunt who registered the work, and the printer Jaggard. It seems to me that they were the ones who benefited. I don't know about Pembroke. As far as it being
so fast forwarding from
venture.
there.
Yeah.
Well, maybe not fast forwarding, but diving into the folio. Obviously, we have this iconic image, one of the worst engravings ever made of anyone, the Droschke engraving of what we're supposed to believe is the face of the writer, that has ended up on, coffee cups, magnets, stuffed dolls, action figures, you name it. And is that then a further endeavor to create the facade, or is it, as some people have argued, a hint that it is a facade? Could they just not resist putting in clues that the truth was the truth?
Well, I think they were trying to depict him as a gentleman, which a Stratford man was. And also they were trying to depict him as a freak of nature. I think that Johnson gave us this clue in his folio, in his play, Every Man in His Humor. And in the 1616 version, he added this line. He was a character was speaking to Master Stephen, who was, in my opinion, the representative of the Stratford man. And he says to him, let the idea of what you are be portrayed in your face, that men may read in your physiognomy, here within this place is to be seen the true, rare, and accomplished monster or miracle of nature, which is all one. So I think that he is saying that we're going to depict him as a monster, in essence. And if you look at that face, it's not very beautiful.
No,
it has a monstrous head. It has weird hair.
Offset weird eyes.
I think that they didn't want you to idolize him, but they also wanted you to show him as a gentleman. So I call him the gentleman monster. He's this freak of nature. He had no education, and yet he was able to be a genius. And that was just right in alignment with what Beaumont was saying, too. And so I think that picture was invented with that idea in mind. And of course, notice in this image, there's no indication of writing. There's no book, there's no pen, there's no laurel leaves. Authors were commonly portrayed in images with laurel leaves in their head, a sign of poetic victory. There's no such thing. And of course, on the opposite page, Johnson's little verse says, to the reader, ignore this picture, read the book. That's how you're going to find out who the author is. So,
which makes me feel like in some way he just couldn't resist. He couldn't help himself. He was part of the charade. He was propagating the myth, but he felt like he had to leave clues for the learned to know the truth.
Yeah, well, I think it was directed to two different audiences. The ones who knew who was the great author, knew who he was, right? They couldn't outright say it was a Stratford man. And then it was for the unknowing readers who knew nothing about who the great author was. This is brand new, and they're just going to go along with it. So, that's why they only hinted at Stratford-on-Avon. Stratford Monument on one page, Avon on another page. That's it, but people took the bait. Right after 1623, they went to Stratford-on-Avon to see the monument. So it worked, And one of those people was John Weaver, who wrote a book about monuments. And we have his notebook where he took down an inscription of the Stratford Monument. And he did not include that in his book of monuments. Meaning he probably didn't think that was the great author's true monument.
Right. And of course, we do know that the original monument had a sack of grain on a pillow. Or no, the sack of grain was the pillow. And then later it became a pillow with a piece of paper and a quill.
Right. It was definitely changed. In one of my chapters, I posit it was changed soon after the Civil War, the English Civil Wars, around 1649, 1650, because there were soldiers housed in the church, and they may have, destroyed it, or, among other things. So it's very possible it was done at that time. And there was work done in the chancel area at that time, too. So
from that point forward, it becomes opportunist after opportunist looking to profit and make money from turning it into a tourist attraction, including one of my favorites, the not so great but very infamous actor David Garrick, who holds the first Shakespeare festival at Stratford, and he calls it a Shakespeare Jubilee, which actually never included a single performance of any Shakespeare play, which goes to show you that it truly was just about capitalizing on the name and trying to make money. And from that day forward, it's become Shakespeare land.
Yes, yes. And only COVID stopped it. temporarily.
Sure. I find it ironic that in the world we look and we see that the quote unquote greatest experts and masters of this topic and the Stratfordian man's life and all that he did and contributed are people who have an extreme financial interest in continuing to propagate that myth. They're attached to the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust. They're making tons of money in academia or in publishing or both, because that seems to be the way that academia makes the most of their money these days is publishing books and then forcing their students to buy those books for their classes. You end up with this situation of these people who are quote unquote authorities, but their conflict of interest is so extreme that I don't understand why we don't raise that issue more often.
Yes, I agree. We should.
Now, granted, you wrote a book, and I'm sure you get some profits off of every time somebody buys one of your books, but it is not your life's work. It is not your source of income. It is not what you. This is a love of a labor of love for you, as opposed to these others, the Shapiros and others who are making fortune after fortune by continuing the myth that it appears Thorpe, Beaumont, and Johnson and Pembroke helped create. Garrick then propagated, and since then has been further propagated by, the Wells of the world, who all draw a paycheck from this.
Yes, you really summed it up well. Yeah, and it's time to correct that. It's the injustice, and how about all the people who love Shakespeare, the plays, right? They read them and they're missing out. They're just reading it one-dimensionally when they could get, 10 different dimensions, history, what's happening in the author's life, all these other references that just really make the reading of it complete and joyous.
I fully agree, as you know, not only as a lover of the works, but also as a theater artist. And I say regularly that, knowing what I know about the author helps me to be a better director of the works. It helps me to be a better actor portraying the roles in the works. And I truly believe that as time moves forward and more grassroots people come to this movement, that it will result in a resurgence of interest in these works. Shakespeare's sort of under attack right now. There are certain movements out there that, he's misogynist, he's racist, he's imperialist, and he's horrible, and we shouldn't be teaching him anymore. And I think that that's an easy attack on a writer who has this sort of floating head on a weird, awkward collar. But I think it's a more difficult attack to make on a writer who is as human as Edward de Vere was, and who had all the frailties that he had, and was the underdog that he was in court, and the rebel that he was against many of those things. And I think it's easier then to see him as not a misogynist, but a feminist. Yeah, I think he still was an imperialist because he was definitely a loyalist to the crown mostly. But he's definitely not a racist. He's the guy who opens our eyes to the equality of emotion within different races, in my interpretations
what about Othello?
of the works.
Yes.
Because he was such a Neapolitan himself. And certainly his time in Venice exposed him to so many different cultures of people. I mean, it was the metropolitan city of its day. It was the New York City of its day.
Yes.
And I believe the more people who recognize him as the true author, the more they will be able to better enjoy the works, and the works will receive a resurgence of popularity as we move forward. I truly believe that.
And not only that, but research. They're going to be researching every person that Oxford ever knew. And they're going to be finding all sorts of new things about him. And to me, that would be the most exciting time, uncovering new letters, new information, and his biography will grow and grow and grow. And I'm really looking forward to that time. And I just pray and hope that more people will get involved in this movement, especially young people.
That you have helped knock another chink in that armor today with this episode. And I'm so grateful that you could join us again for another episode. And I hope that we can have you back for even another future episode on another topic of this nature. I hope that, and I know that you join me in encouraging everyone who's listening, that if they want to see that dawn come, that they can be a part of that. And one of the best ways to be a part of that is joining the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship. It's a very inexpensive way to contribute to the organization and contribute to the movement in general, as well as receive extra benefits for your membership, such as access to the quarterly newsletters, special emails regarding news, information, events, and activities of the organization, as well as to become a voting member of the organization and contribute in that way. So I hope those of you who are listening, if you haven't already gone to the website, please go to shakespeareoxfordfellowship.org, shakespeareoxfordfellowship.org, click on join, submit your information, do your PayPal, your credit card, or whatever you have. It's an annual thing. It's so inexpensive for you to join. You can join as an individual. There are student memberships too for those of you who are students and have more limited finances. You could do a family membership, which is very economical if you have multiple members in your family who would like to be members of the organization. Please consider, if you haven't already, joining us, me, Katherine, and the countless others who are members of this organization and a part of this movement, and help us accomplish these goals. Together we can, and together we will, pardon the pun, make a change. Thank you, Katherine, so much for joining us again. It's so quick how fast an hour can fly by. But I'm so thrilled that we were able to answer, like I said at the top of the program, so many questions that I received from listeners about this very portion of it. How did this happen? Why did it happen? And I think you helped answer a lot of the questions that we have received about this aspect of it. I encourage everyone, if you want to know more, go to shakespeareoxfordfellowship.org and rabbit hole that place. You can find so much information there. There are articles. There are past issues of the Oxfordian available. There are interviews of people that you can learn how they became an Oxfordian, how they became a part of this movement. You can find out so much information about some of the names, some of the topics, some of the other things that we mentioned here in the program and on previous programs. And if you can't find what you're looking for there, shoot me an email. Contact at don'tquillthepodcast.com. Don'tquillthepodcast.com. Contact at don'tquillthepodcast.com. Please send me your recommendations, your comments, your reviews. We'll even take your critiques. Love to hear from you. We always love to hear from our fellow quillers out there. Thank you for joining us from wherever you are, all across the world, 46 different countries. We're so thrilled to have you all. And we look forward to you joining us for another exciting episode 2 weeks from today. And remember, from this day forward, keep asking questions.
If you've enjoyed today's episode, please leave a rating and review in your podcast player. For even more, visit our website, don'tquillthepodcast.com. There you can find official merchandise in our shop, as well as a link to our Patreon. This show is made possible by people like you. We hope you'll consider showing your support by becoming a monthly patron, where you'll receive bonus material and tons of exclusive perks. You can also join in the conversation on our Discord and by following us at Don't Quill the Pod on all social media. All of this can be found at don'tquillthepodcast.com, don'tquillthepodcast.com.
It's Dragon Wagon.